Hi, my name is Brandon and I'm an alcoholic and addict in recovery. And the last couple of videos, I've talked a lot about the way that we define ourselves and how that can often create limitations for who we really are and the way that we experience life. And continuing that conversation today with some reading from The Untethered Soul by Michael A. Singer. And I'm going to jump right into it because he introduces an idea that's really important for this conversation. He says, in truth, the very responsibility of having to hold it all together is itself a form of suffering. You notice this most when things start to fall apart outside. Your psyche goes into turmoil and you have to struggle to hold your inner world together. But what exactly are you trying to hold on to? The only things in there are your thoughts, emotions, and movements of energy, none of which are solid. They're like clouds, simply coming and going through vast inner space. But you keep holding on to them as though consistency can substitute for stability. The Buddhists have a term for this, clinging. And in the end, clinging is what the psyche is all about. So the idea of clinging comes up repeatedly in readings about not only spirituality, especially when you read about it from a Buddhist perspective, but in recovery as well. The idea that we take an idea, we take an event, or we take something, anything, and we focus our conscious experience onto it. And we get really laser focused on it, and then we start to build around that. We say, I really like this. I'm going to hold on to this, make it a part of my life, and I'm going to actually start to build my life around it. So in a sense, that's exactly what's happening with addiction. We're clinging on to the idea that, we love the feeling of whatever drug we've chosen. We love that feeling. And we want to experience more of that feeling. We want that feeling present more often in our lives. And so we cling to that and we start to say, okay, what do I need to do? How do I need to build my life around this in order to maximize that feeling? How do I need to, what work do I need to do in order to make this feeling happen as often as possible? What friends do I need to see? What kind of schedule do I need to keep? And it becomes a desperate attempt to keep that feeling in our lives at the expense of everything else that's going on around it. So the way that we do this, he explains it by saying, when consciousness concentrates narrowly enough, it loses its broader sense of self. Right? That sounds a lot like addiction. We're so focused on the feeling, the drug, what it creates, that we lose our sense of other things going on both within ourselves and in the world around us. It no longer experiences itself as a field of pure consciousness. It begins to relate itself more to the objects it's focused upon. So now we start to relate more with the drug and relate more with the experience than we do with the rest of the world. And we lose that sense of belonging. And this is why isolating becomes such a big part of addiction for so many people, is they lose that connection, that sense of connection with the rest of the world, the non-drug world starts to go away as their consciousness focuses more and more and more on the drug and the experience of the drug and getting the drug and preparing to use the drug and recovering from use of the drug and all of the things around the drug use. And that's really what's going on here, is we've taken this clinging to an extreme and focused it with the help of all of the chemicals and neurons in our brain, laser focused it on drugs and alcohol. And so he goes on to say, but what determines where you focus your consciousness? At the most basic level, it's simply determined by anything that catches your awareness because it stands out from the rest. So Drugs and alcohol, for most addicts, stand out from the rest of life. They're like a spotlight in the middle of the darkest night. Especially for anyone who is in pain and then has that pain relieved by drugs and alcohol. They stand out more than anything else in the consciousness. And so this definitely applies to addiction. To understand this, imagine that your consciousness is simply observing vast inner. Well, I'm not going to read that part. It kind of goes into a metaphor. It's a little weird. Um, so going to Okay, sorry. Going to the bottom of the next paragraph, he says, in the midst of the expanse of empty mind, by clinging to passing thought objects, you make an island of apparent solidity. Once you have a thought that stays, you can rest your head on it. Then, as you cling to more and more thoughts, you build an inner structure for consciousness to focus on. The more consciousness narrows its focus onto this mental structure, the greater the tendency to utilize it to define the concept of self. Clinging creates the bricks and mortar with which we build a conceptual self. So this is really important because what becomes incredibly difficult for addicts, what here from my perspective, what became incredibly difficult for me is that I had been introduced to the feeling of drugs and alcohol. I loved that feeling. It was like a beacon in the night to me, and I focused my consciousness on it. And I said, I want to maximize this feeling. I want to feel it as much as possible, as often as possible. And did the clinging to that. I clung to that idea. I started to build my self around that. So I became the person who always got drunk at the party. I became the person who went out and got high all the time. I became the person who loved those things, who advocated for those things, who thought that that was the way to live life. As the years went on, I became the person who incorporated that into my day to day routine and started doing it more and more until it was an all day type thing. And then I became the person who had to take care of the consequences as a result of that. And this whole time, I'm building my entire sense of self around the drug, the experience of the drug, and the recovery from that experience. And so I created this sense of self to a point where when I started thinking, maybe I need to moderate some, maybe I need to give this up, it felt like I was attacking myself. It felt like I was saying to myself, it felt like I was threatening my own sense of being. If someone else suggested the same thing, it felt like that as well. It felt like someone was attacking my identity because the identity I had built for myself revolved around the use of drugs and alcohol. And so when I felt attacked, that did not increase my likelihood of wanting to give these things up. And this is the exact reason that things like interventions often have a very negative effect on that. They may have a short-term effect to get the alcoholic or addict in the door to a treatment center, but they long term they typically do not have a positive effect because it's an attack to the drug user. It's an attack on their sense of self, and so we have to get to a point where we're starting to go beyond that in our questioning and saying, well, is this really who I am? And until you're at that point, it's very difficult to conceive of not being a drug or alcohol user because you've built your whole sense of self around that. So here's what he writes that really got to me this morning. Who are you that is lost in trying to build a concept of yourself in order to be found? This question represents the essence of spirituality. You will never find yourself in what you have built to define yourself. I'm going to leave it at that for today. And just think about that. You will never find yourself in what you have built to define yourself. And tomorrow I'll get into the rest of what he has to say about this because I think it's incredibly important. And it goes to everything I've been talking about in the last few videos, which is what we build to define ourselves, the walls that we define ourselves, the walls we put up to protect ourselves, the house we build out of those walls is actually what keeps us from being as spiritually free as we possibly can be. So we need to work on tearing that down. And he goes into that a little bit more. And we'll talk more about that tomorrow. In the meantime, I hope you have a great day today.